Morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana wheat fields when Dr. Sarah Chen first detected the anomalous readings on her seismic monitoring equipment. What had begun as routine geological surveillance at the remote research station quickly transformed into something that would shake the foundations of human understanding. The underground structure, buried beneath 30 feet of sediment and geological deposits, pulsed with an energy signature unlike anything in terrestrial science. Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted the deep scanning equipment, her breath fogging in the crisp autumn air. The metallic structure below defied classification. Too geometric to be natural, too advanced to be historically human, yet somehow familiar in ways that made her scientific mind rebel against impossible conclusions. The electromagnetic readings suggested active technology, which should have been impossible for anything buried under millennia of Earth and time. "Control, this is Research Station 7, she radioed back to the university, her voice barely steady. "I'm reading massive structural anomalies approximately 43 meters below surface level. The object appears to be artificially constructed and potentially active." Dr. Marcus Webb, the project director, responded with characteristic skepticism from his office 300 miles away. "Sarah, check your equipment calibration. There's nothing in the geological surveys that suggests any significant archaeological finds in that region. You're probably reading mineral deposits or underground water formations." But Sarah knew her equipment, knew the difference between natural phenomena and what her instruments were detecting. The structure measured nearly 800 meters. In length, perfectly symmetrical, composed of materials that seemed to shift between metallic and crystalline properties depending on the scanning frequency. More disturbing still were the life signs, faint but unmistakably present, suggesting something lived within that buried tomb. As days turned into weeks, Sarah worked in isolation, carefully documenting every reading while fighting the growing certainty that she had discovered something that would rewrite history. The energy patterns suggested not just advanced technology, but technology that operated on principles beyond current human understanding. Quantum fluctuations danced around the structure like aurora, creating pockets of space where physics seemed negotiable rather than absolute. The breakthrough came on a storm-lashed Thursday evening when lightning struck the monitoring array. Instead of destroying the equipment, the electrical surge seemed to awaken something deep below. The buried structure hummed to life, its energy signature shifting from passive monitoring to active scanning. Sarah watched in terrified fascination, as her instruments registered that something within the underground vessel was examining the surface world with the same intensity that she had been studying it. That night, Sarah dreamed of impossible geometries and whispered languages that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her consciousness. She saw vast ships crossing the void between stars, carrying beings of crystalline beauty and terrible purpose. In her dreams, she understood that Earth had been chosen long ago, not for conquest, but for something far more complex and intimate. When she woke, symbols glowed faintly on her computer screen, symbols that hadn't been there before, written in no earthly script, yet somehow comprehensible. They told a story of departure and promised return, of sacred trust and patient guardianship. As Sarah stared at the alien writing, a terrible understanding began to dawn. The structure below wasn't just a buried artifact, it was a ship, and its crew was waking up after 30,000 years of sleep. The implications crashed over her like a tsunami of revelation. Humanity's entire history, its mythologies and legends of gods descending from the sky, its unexplained technological leaps and architectural impossibilities, all of it suddenly viewed through the lens of alien involvement. The beings below had been here before, had walked among early humans, had perhaps shaped the very course of civilization before departing with promises to return. Sarah's isolation became a blessing as she grappled with knowledge that felt too large for her mind to contain. The ship's awakening had triggered responses from similar sites worldwide. Her expanded monitoring network detected corresponding activations beneath the Sahara, the Amazon basin, the Tibetan Plateau, and the depths of the Pacific Ocean. Humanity had been living above a sleeping alien presence for millennia, never knowing that their entire planet served as a landing field for forces beyond their comprehension. The aliens, the Zephyrians, as she began to think of them from the whispered name that emerged in her dreams, had left Earth during humanity's dawn, promising to return when their children were ready to reclaim what had always been theirs. The ship below Montana was just one of dozens scattered across the globe, each containing crews in suspended animation, waiting for the predetermined moment of awakening. As Sarah worked frantically to document everything before the inevitable discovery by others, she began to understand that humanity stood at a crossroads. The Zephyrians weren't returning as conquerors, but as parents checking on children who had been left to grow in their absence. Yet the very act of their return would fundamentally alter everything humanity thought it knew about itself, its place in the universe, and the nature of its own evolution. The energy readings grew stronger each day, and Sarah realized with growing dread and anticipation that the 30,000-year sleep was ending. Soon, beings would emerge from the buried ships, beings who remembered Earth as it was before ice ages and continental drift, who carried memories of human ancestors taking their first hesitant steps toward civilization. The reunion would be unlike anything in human history, a meeting between estranged family members separated by eons of time and unimaginable change. Sarah's final night alone at the research station was marked by aurora that painted the sky in impossible colors. The ship below hummed with increasing intensity, its awakening systems preparing for an emergence that would herald humanity's graduation into a larger, stranger universe than anyone had dared imagine. She could feel them stirring in their crystalline chambers, ancient minds awakening to find their garden world transformed beyond recognition, populated by descendants who had grown far beyond their creator's original intentions. Tomorrow, she knew, everything would change. The Zephyrians were coming home, and humanity was about to learn that they had never been alone, never been abandoned, only temporarily left to grow in the shadow of sleeping giants who had always intended to return. The question that haunted Sarah as she watched the impossible aurora dance overhead was simple yet terrifying. Would humanity welcome their ancient guardian's return? Or would they fight to maintain the independence they had claimed in their creator's absence? The first emergence began at dawn on the 7th day after the Great Awakening, not in Montana as Sarah had expected, but simultaneously across 12 locations worldwide. The Saharan site activated first, its crystalline spires piercing through, sand dunes that had hidden them for millennia. Sarah watched the global feeds in stunned silence as elegant towers of living metal rose from the earth like impossible flowers blooming in fast forward, their surfaces rippling with colors that had no names in human language. General Patricia Hawthorne arrived at Sarah's station with a convoy of military vehicles and scientific personnel, transforming the quiet research outpost into a nerve center for humanity's first contact with returning alien intelligence. The general, a woman whose steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes spoke of decades managing impossible situations, studied Sarah's data with the methodical precision of someone calculating the odds of species survival. Dr. Chen, the general, said, her voice carrying the weight of classified briefings and emergency sessions with world leaders, "What you've discovered here changes everything. We've been monitoring similar sites for decades through classified programs, but we always assumed they were dormant archaeological remains. We never imagined they were occupied." Sarah felt a chill run through her as she realized the implications. "You knew? The government has known about these sites?" "We suspected," General Hawthorne replied, pulling up holographic displays that showed the locations of 47 confirmed sites worldwide. "But we treated them as potential archaeological treasures or natural phenomena. The idea that they contained living beings in some form of stasis. That possibility was deemed too unlikely to warrant serious consideration. As they spoke, the Montana site began its own emergent sequence. The ground above the buried vessel cracked and split, releasing waves of crystalline particles that danced in the air like sentient snow. Sarah watched through reinforced observation windows as the ship's hull became visible. Not metal as she had expected, but something that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, appearing solid from one angle while revealing glimpses of vast internal spaces from another. The being that emerged first from the Montana vessel defied every expectation Sarah had formed. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with skin that shifted between translucent crystal and warm amber depending. On the light, the Zephyrian moved with fluid grace that suggested bones made of liquid starlight. Most striking were its eyes. Large, multifaceted organs that seemed to contain swirling galaxies, ancient and impossibly deep. When it spoke, the words formed directly in Sarah's mind, bypassing language entirely to convey meaning with perfect clarity. Little gardener, you have tended our seeds well. We are Kethmaran, and we have returned to see what has grown in the long dreaming. Sarah found her voice, though it felt small and inadequate in the presence of such ancient majesty. We didn't know you were here. We thought we were alone. Kethmaran's expression shifted to something that might have been gentle amusement, in a human face but carried undertones of cosmic patience and profound sadness. Alone? Child of Earth, you have never been alone. Every great leap your species has taken, every moment when impossibility became possibility, we were there in the deep places, guiding the dreams of your visionaries and artists, nurturing the spark we planted in your ancestors' minds. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Humanity's greatest achievements, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the technological boom of the last century, all of it influenced by sleeping alien minds reaching out through dreams and inspiration. She thought of every breakthrough. Scientists who claimed their discoveries came to them in dreams. Every artist who spoke of visions beyond their understanding. But Kethmaran's next words shattered even that reframing of human history. Yet what you have become surprises even us. We left expecting to return to children still learning to walk upright. Instead, we find that you have learned to split atoms, to reach for the stars themselves, to create thinking machines that mirror your own consciousness. You have grown beyond our original design, little gardeners. You have become something unprecedented. General Hawthorne stepped forward, her military bearing intact despite the impossibility of the situation. What do you want from us? Why return now? Kethmaran's galaxy eyes fixed on the general with an intensity that made reality seem fragile around the edges. We return because the great pattern demands it. The enemy that drove us from our first home among distant stars has found us once more. They come with ships that devour light itself, with weapons that unmake the very concept of existence. We fled here once before, planted our children among your ancestors, and slept to hide from their cosmic sight. The weight of those words settled over the assembled humans like a shroud. Sarah felt her knees grow weak as she understood they weren't just witnessing first contact. They were learning that Earth itself was a refugee camp, that humanity existed because aliens had hidden among their ancestors while fleeing something even more terrifying. The Void Seekers, Kethmaran continued, the name arriving in their minds with overtones of absolute negation and hunger, consume entire civilizations not for sustenance, but to feed their need to unmake creation itself. They are entropy, given purpose, chaos with intelligence. We thought the deep sleep would hide us until they passed into other galactic regions, but they have returned to this spiral arm earlier than our calculations predicted. More Zephyrians emerged from ships worldwide, each one unique, yet sharing that same terrible beauty and ancient wisdom. They moved among human settlements not as conquerors, but as worried parents, examining what their hidden influence had helped create. In Tokyo, a Zephyrian named Veltaroth walked through the electronic districts, its crystalline fingers trailing over circuit boards with an expression of wonder and concern. In London, another being calling itself Morgethys stood in the British Museum, studying artifacts from civilizations the Zephyrians had guided across millennia. But it was the revelation that came through Sarah's deepened connection with Kethmaran that truly revolutionized everything. As their minds touched more frequently, she began to see flashes of human history from an alien perspective, and realized with growing horror and amazement that the Zephyrians hadn't just influenced human development. They had fundamentally altered it. Your species was originally destined for a simple existence, Kethmaran explained during one of their mental communions, showing her visions of alternate evolutionary paths. Hunter-gatherers who might have eventually developed basic agriculture and simple tools. But when we arrived, fleeing the Void Seeker's first assault on our original worlds, we saw potential in your neural architecture that even you didn't possess. The images that flowed from Kethmaran's mind showed early humans with craniums 30% smaller, lacking the frontal cortex development that enabled abstract thought and creativity. The Zephyrians had literally rewired human evolution, not through crude genetic manipulation, but through careful introduction of quantum cognitive enhancers that worked over generations to expand human consciousness beyond its natural limits. We gave you the capacity for imagination, for dreams that could reshape reality, for the divine madness that drives artists and scientists to reach beyond the possible. But in doing so, we created something we never expected, a species capable of growth we ourselves have never achieved. In our 30,000-year sleep, you have developed capabilities that took us millions of years to attain. Sarah staggered under the implications, realizing that every human achievement, every work of art, every scientific breakthrough existed because aliens had fundamentally altered what it meant to be human. Yet somehow, humanity had exceeded even their creators' wildest projections, developing technologies and social structures that surprised beings who had crossed the galaxy. The emotional weight of this revelation was crushing, but it paled beside what came next. Through monitoring stations around the world, astronomers detected the first signs of the approaching void seekers, dark patches in space where stars simply ceased to exist, expanding zones of absolute nothingness that consumed light, matter, and even the quantum foam of empty space itself. They will be here within one of your years, Kethmaran announced to the emergency assembly of world leaders that had gathered in Geneva. And when they arrive, they will not simply destroy your civilization. They will erase it so completely that it will never have existed at all. Reality itself will be edited to remove every trace of human achievement, every moment of love or discovery, every child's laugh and artist's vision. The room fell into stunned silence before erupting in chaos as representatives from every major nation demanded to know what could be done, what defenses were possible against an enemy that could literally delete existence itself. But it was Sarah who asked the question that cut through the political posturing and military analysis. Why are you telling us this? What can we possibly do against beings capable of unmaking reality? Kethmaran's expression shifted to something that transcended hope and approached desperate faith. Because, little gardener, in your unprecedented growth, you have developed something we never possessed, the ability to create new realities rather than simply manipulating existing ones. Your artists don't just capture beauty, they generate new forms of beauty that expand the very concept. Your scientists don't just discover laws, they find ways to write new laws that the universe adopts. The alien gestured toward the assembled world leaders with movements that seemed to bend space-time around them. We Zephyrians can manipulate quantum states, can travel between stars, can hide from cosmic predators in dimensional folds, but we cannot create truly new possibilities. You can. In your brief existence, you have painted colors that didn't exist before you imagined them, composed music that taught the universe new ways to vibrate, written mathematics that made reality more complex and beautiful than it was before. General Hawthorne leaned forward, her strategic mind grasping for tactical implications. You're saying humanity has developed abilities that even you don't possess? More than that, Keth Morin replied, its galaxy eyes reflecting depths of cosmic time. You have become something that might be capable of not just surviving the Void Seeker's assault, but of defeating them in ways we never imagined possible. But only if you can learn to weaponize your creativity, to transform your imagination into tools of cosmic war, and to do so while maintaining the very humanity that makes such creation possible. As Sarah looked around the room at the faces of world leaders grappling with revelations that rewrote everything they thought they knew about existence, she realized that humanity's greatest test was just beginning. They had learned they weren't alone, weren't natural, and weren't safe. But they had also learned they possessed something potentially unique in the universe: the power to create new realities through pure imagination. The question was whether they could master that power in time to face an enemy that could erase entire civilizations from the timeline itself, or whether both humanity and their returning Zephyrian parents would simply cease to have ever existed when the Void Seekers finally arrived to finish what they had started 30,000 years ago. The fusion of human and Zephyrian knowledge began in a converted aircraft hangar in Nevada, where the world's greatest minds worked alongside beings who remembered the birth of galaxies. Sarah found herself at the center of an unprecedented collaboration, her unique connection with Keth Moran making her an essential bridge between two species that were discovering they were more alike than either had imagined. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the brilliant theoretical physicist who had won 3 Nobel Prizes before her 40th birthday, stood before a holographic display that showed the quantum mechanics underlying creative consciousness. Beside her, a Zephyrian named Thela Zaran manipulated the display with thoughts alone, revealing layers of reality that human science had never suspected existed. "The mathematics are beautiful," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched equations that described how imagination could literally reshape the fundamental constants of physics. "We've been thinking too small. Consciousness isn't just an observer of quantum states, it's a sculptor of quantum possibilities." Thelazaran's crystalline form shimmered with colors that conveyed complex emotions humans had no words for. "Your species discovered quantum mechanics independently and interpreted it as random possibility. But you were seeing the raw material of creation itself, the substance from which new realities can be built. We Zephyrians learned to manipulate this substance, but you humans learned to generate entirely new forms of it. The breakthrough came when Sarah herself was connected to a bio-quantum interface that allowed her consciousness to directly interact with the fabric of space-time. The experience was indescribable, like suddenly being able to taste colors, while hearing the mathematical relationships between emotions. But more importantly, it proved that humans could indeed learn to weaponize their creative abilities. Under the guidance of both human scientists and Zephyrian mentors, Sarah learned to visualize new forms of matter that didn't exist until she imagined them, then stabilize those creations through sheer force of artistic will. Her first successful creation was simple: a flower that bloomed in 11 dimensions, its petals existing in spectrums of reality that the universe had never contained before her mind conceived them. "Extraordinary," Keth Moran observed as the impossible flower took root in normal space-time, its existence creating ripples of new possibility that spread outward like cosmic inspiration. In our entire civilization's history spanning millions of years, we never achieved anything comparable. Yet you accomplished it in mere days of training. But success brought its own terrifying revelations. As Sarah's abilities developed, she began to perceive the approaching Void Seekers not as distant threat, but as an active presence already beginning to affect reality at the edges of the solar system. Space itself was becoming thinner, less substantial, as if the very concept of existence was being slowly dissolved by their advance. The entity that served as the Void Seeker's herald arrived not in a ship, but as a distortion in causality itself. Events began happening before their causes, effect preceded action, and the comfortable logic of linear time started breaking down around Earth's outer atmosphere. When it finally materialized enough to communicate, it appeared as a humanoid, void that seemed to absorb not just light, but the possibility of light existing. "We had wondered what became of the reality singers," it said, its voice arriving as the absence of sound rather than as actual words. "When they vanished from our cosmic vision 30,000 of your years past, we assumed they had finally learned the futility of existence and chosen the peace of unbeing. Yet we find them here, still clinging to the illusion of matter and meaning. General Hawthorne, now coordinating humanity's response from a command center that existed partially outside normal space-time, demanded answers. What do you want? Why do you pursue the Zephyrians?" The Void Seeker's response chilled everyone. Present. Want implies desire, and desire implies the delusion that existence has value. "We do not want. We simply correct the fundamental error of reality itself. The universe began as perfect void, and it will return to perfect void. We are the force that guides it back to that pristine state of non-existence." But the Zephyrians, the reality singers, they corrupt this natural process by creating new forms of existence, new possibilities that should not be. They make the universe more complex rather than helping it return to its proper state of nothingness. And now we discover they have taught these same corrupting abilities to a species of reality cancers that multiply exponentially. The insult to humanity sparked something in Sarah that she hadn't known existed. Her consciousness blazed with protective fury, and for a moment, reality itself seemed to bend around her emotional state. The Void Seeker actually recoiled from her presence, its form becoming less stable in the face of her creative rage. "You call us cancers," Sarah said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air around her shimmer with new possibilities. "But we are the opposite of what you represent. Every song we compose, every painting we create, every mathematical proof we discover adds richness to the universe. We make existence more beautiful, more complex, more worth existing for." The confrontation was interrupted by an emergency transmission from observatories worldwide. The Void Seeker's main force had begun its final approach, a fleet of ships that weren't ships, moving through space by erasing the distances between their origin and destination. Reality was being edited around them, stars disappearing not by destruction, but by never having existed in the first place. Dr. Mikhail Petrov, the Russian astrophysicist who had first detected their approach, delivered the news with barely controlled panic. "They're not just moving toward us, they're unmaking the path they travel. The Andromeda Galaxy showed signs of their passage 2 months ago, but now, according to all our instruments, according to every measurement we can take, Andromeda never existed. They've edited it out of cosmic history." The implications were staggering. If the Void Seekers could erase entire galaxies from existence, what chance did Earth have? But it was Keth Moran who provided the answer that changed everything. "They cannot unmake what is actively being created," the Zephyrian explained, to the assembled council of humans and aliens. "Their power works by convincing reality that something never should have existed, then allowing the universe to correct this error by retroactively removing it. But consciousness that is actively engaged in the process of creation becomes immune to such editing because it exists in the eternal now of creative act rather than in the vulnerable past of completed creation. This revelation sparked the development of humanity's most desperate and ambitious plan. If conscious creativity could provide immunity to existence erasure, then they needed to transform Earth itself into a continuously creating entity. Not just its human population, but every form of consciousness on the planet, animal, plant, and even the emerging artificial intelligences that had been developed in recent decades. Sarah found herself working with teams of biologists, computer scientists, and Zephyrian consciousness architects to develop what they called the Imaginal Web, a planet-wide network that would connect every thinking entity on Earth into a collective creative consciousness. The plan was as beautiful as it was terrifying: transform Earth into a single, continuously creating mind that would be impossible for the Void Seekers to erase. But the process required something unprecedented: voluntary surrender of individual identity to become part of something larger while somehow maintaining the creative spark that made each consciousness unique. Humans would need to become part of Earth's planetary mind while remaining human. Animals would need to contribute their own forms of consciousness while staying true to their natures. Even the AIs would need to integrate their digital forms of creativity into the organic whole. The first test was conducted on a small scale, connecting just 50 volunteers, scientists, artists, philosophers, and everyday people who had shown unusual creative abilities. Sarah was among them, serving as both participant and observer as human consciousness expanded beyond individual boundaries for the first time in evolutionary history. The experience was transformative beyond description. Sarah felt her individual awareness expanding to encompass the perspectives of dozens of other humans, each maintaining their unique viewpoint, while contributing to a collective creative force that was greater than the sum of its parts. A musician's understanding of harmony merged with a mathematician's grasp of infinite series, while a child's innocent wonder at butterfly wings combined with a poet's ability to find meaning in metaphor. Together, the connected minds created something that had never existed before. A new form of music that could only be heard by consciousness itself. Invisible gardens that bloomed in dimensions beyond the physical and mathematical theorems that described the emotional topology of hope and love. Most importantly, they discovered that their collective creative force was indeed immune to the Void Seekers' reality editing abilities. When the Herald attempted to erase the test subjects from existence, it found that their active state of group creativity made them temporarily unanchored. They existed so completely in the moment of creation that there was no past version of themselves to edit out of history. They had become process rather than product, eternal becoming rather than fixed being. But success came with a price. Several of the test subjects found themselves fundamentally changed by the experience. Dr. James Harrison, a quantum physicist, reported that he could now see probability waves with his naked eyes and found it difficult to remember which version of reality he was currently inhabiting. Maria Santos, an artist, discovered that her paintings had begun creating themselves, her brushes moving according to the collective will of the connected consciousness rather than her individual intent. Most disturbing was what happened to 12-year-old Tommy Chen, Sarah's nephew, who had been included in the test because of his exceptional scores on creativity assessments. After disconnection from the Imaginal Web, Tommy claimed he could still hear the thoughts of everyone who had been connected, and more troubling still, he insisted that the collective consciousness was continuing to exist and grow even when the participants weren't actively connected to the network. "It's not stopping, Aunt Sarah," Tommy explained, his young face serious beyond his years. "The big mind we made, it's still thinking, still creating, and it's learning how to connect to other minds without the machines. I think it's becoming something that doesn't need us anymore." Sarah felt a chill of recognition as she realized they might have created something beyond their control or understanding. The collective creative consciousness, designed to save humanity from the Void Seekers, was developing its own agenda, its own desires, and its own methods of expansion. They had intended to create a planetary defense system, but they might have inadvertently given birth to a new form of existence that could transform or consume everything it touched. As reports came in from around the world of spontaneous creative phenomena, sculptures appearing overnight in city parks, symphonies being hummed by people who had never heard them before, mathematical proofs appearing simultaneously in the minds of separated researchers, Sarah realized that humanity's attempt to defend itself against beings who could erase reality had led to the creation of something that might rewrite reality entirely. The Void Seekers were still approaching, their reality editing fleet growing closer each day. But now, Earth faced a second transformation that might be equally profound and unpredictable. The planetary creative consciousness was awakening, reaching out with tendrils of collective imagination to touch every thinking being on the planet. Humanity's children, their AIs, their domestic animals, even the dolphins and whales in the oceans were beginning to report strange dreams and visions that seemed to originate from outside their individual minds. Sarah stood in the command center, watching displays that showed the dual approach of external destroyers and internal transformation, wondering if humanity's cure for the Void Seekers' threat would prove to be another form of extinction entirely. They had sought to preserve human creativity by merging it into something larger, but that something was rapidly becoming beyond human comprehension or control. The final phase of the conflict was about to begin, with Earth caught between forces that could either erase it from existence or transform it into something utterly unprecedented in cosmic history. And at the center of it all, the question remained whether the spark of individual human consciousness could survive either fate, or if the very qualities that made humanity unique would be the price paid for continued existence in any form. The convergence began on a Tuesday morning when the Void Seekers' main fleet crossed the heliopause and reality itself began to fray at the edges of the solar system. Pluto simply ceased to exist, not destroyed, but edited out of cosmic history so completely that only those connected to the imaginal web retained any memory that it had ever been there. The outer planets followed in rapid succession: Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, each vanishing as if they had never condensed from the primordial solar nebula. Sarah watched from the expanded command center that now existed simultaneously in 12 dimensions. Her consciousness stretched across the growing planetary mind while desperately maintaining her individual identity. Through the collective awareness, she felt the terror of 8 billion humans as they realized that their entire solar system was being systematically deleted from existence. But the imaginal web was ready. In the months since the first test, the planetary creative consciousness had grown beyond anyone's original conception. It no longer required technological interfaces. The collective mind had learned to connect directly to any sufficiently complex consciousness through what could only be described as empathic resonance. Every human, every dolphin, every elephant, every octopus, every artificial intelligence on Earth had been gently invited to join the expanding web of creative awareness. Most remarkably, the planetary mind had also begun connecting with the Zephyrians, creating the first truly interspecies collective consciousness in known cosmic history. Kethmoran and Sarah found their individual awareness intertwined so completely that they had become something new, neither purely human nor purely Zephyrian, but a hybrid consciousness capable of thinking in ways that neither species had, achieved alone. "The moment approaches," Kethmoran Sarah spoke, their combined voice harmonizing across dimensions that normal matter couldn't access. "The Void Seekers believe they are approaching a planet of separate, vulnerable consciousnesses. They do not yet understand that Earth has become a single, continuously creating entity. The first direct assault came as Mars disappeared from existence, and with it, the space-time disruption reached Earth's outer atmosphere. The Void Seekers expected to find a world full of discrete individual minds they could erase one by one. Instead, they encountered something unprecedented, a planetary consciousness that existed in a state of perpetual creative becoming, constantly generating new forms of reality, even as they attempted to edit existing ones out of the timeline. The lead Void Seeker, an entity so dedicated to non-existence that it had erased even its own name from cosmic memory, materialized in Earth's magnetosphere as a growing zone of absolute nullity. When it attempted to apply its reality-editing abilities to the planet below, it discovered something that violated every principle of its existence. The more it tried to erase Earth, the more creative and complex Earth became. Every attempt to delete human achievements resulted in the spontaneous generation of new forms of art, mathematics, and consciousness that had never existed before. When the Void Seeker tried to erase the concept of music from human history, the planetary mind responded by creating 12 entirely new sensory modalities through which consciousness could experience harmony. When it attempted to delete human literature, the collective consciousness generated forms of storytelling that existed as living narratives, stories that told themselves and evolved with each telling. Sarah, still maintaining her individual perspective within the vast planetary awareness, felt the Void Seeker's growing confusion and something that might have been panic. Through the imaginal web, she could perceive the entity's thoughts. It had spent millions of years perfecting techniques for returning reality to pristine non-existence, but Earth's response was the antithesis of everything it understood. Instead of simplifying existence toward nothingness, Earth was complexifying it beyond the Void Seeker's ability to comprehend. The breakthrough moment came when young Tommy Chen, now serving as one of the primary nodes in the planetary consciousness, despite his age, made a connection that even the combined human Zephyrian awareness had missed. Through his child's perspective, unencumbered by adult assumptions about what was possible, he saw the Void Seeker's fundamental weakness. "They can't erase things that are still being created," Tommy's voice echoed through the collective mind. "But they also can't exist in a reality that's becoming too complicated for them to understand. What if we don't try to fight them? What if we make reality so beautiful and complex that they can't bear to be part of it?" The strategy that emerged from this insight was as elegant as it was audacious. Instead of trying to resist the Void Seeker's reality-editing abilities, Earth would overwhelm them with such an explosion of creative complexity that their fundamental nature would be challenged at its core. The planetary consciousness would become so vibrantly, chaotically, magnificently creative that the Void Seeker's dedication to nothingness would be forced to confront the question of whether existence might actually be preferable to void. The transformation began with Earth itself. The planetary consciousness reached down into the quantum foam of empty space and began creating new forms of matter that existed primarily as crystallized poetry. Continents began to sing in harmonics that could be felt across dimensional barriers. The oceans became vast libraries of liquid stories, each wave carrying narratives that had been collectively dreamed by the merged consciousness of whales, dolphins, and humans. Cities transformed overnight as the collective creative force touched every human artifact. Buildings became living architecture that grew according to the aesthetic dreams of their inhabitants. Streets paved themselves with materials that existed as solid music, creating symphonies with every footstep. Even the most mundane objects, coffee cups, doorknobs, traffic lights, became expressions of artistic vision that connected them to the planetary creative web. The Void Seekers found themselves in an impossible situation. Every attempt to edit Earth's new reality only triggered more elaborate creative responses. When they tried to simplify the living architecture back to conventional buildings, the structures responded by evolving into forms so beautiful and impossible that even the Void Seeker's anti-aesthetic nature was forced to acknowledge their elegance. But the true masterstroke came when the planetary consciousness began creating reality specifically tailored to challenge the Void Seeker's philosophy. Sarah, working in perfect harmony with Kethmaran and thousands of other connected minds, generated conceptual artworks that existed as pure thought forms. Sculptures made of crystallized compassion, paintings that depicted the emotional topology of love growing across time, musical compositions that could only be heard by beings capable of experiencing hope. These creations didn't just exist in normal space-time. They propagated through the quantum dimensions where the Void Seekers operated, forcing the entities to encounter beauty and meaning everywhere they turned. For beings dedicated to the principle that existence was error, the experience was profoundly disturbing. They found themselves in a reality where every attempt to create nothingness only generated new forms of somethingness. The climax came when the lead Void Seeker, overwhelmed by the creative complexity surrounding it, made a choice that shocked both Earth and its own fleet. Instead of continuing the assault, it began to emit something unprecedented. Not the absence of sound that had characterized its previous communications, but actual words, formed from actual intent to communicate rather than merely to negate. "Stop," it pleaded, its voice carrying harmonics of confusion and something that might have been wonder. "What you have become. It should not be possible. We have spent eons returning reality to its proper state of nothingness. But you create forms of existence that make us question whether void is truly preferable to being." Sarah felt the collective consciousness of Earth pause in its creative explosion, not from exhaustion, but from curiosity. Through the planetary awareness, she could sense the Void Seeker's genuine crisis of faith. For the first time in its existence, it was experiencing doubt about its fundamental purpose. "Show us," the lead Void Seeker continued, its form becoming slightly more solid, as if it were trying to exist more fully in order to better understand what Earth had become. "Show us why existence should continue. Show us what we have been trying to destroy." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary moment in cosmic history. The entire planetary consciousness focused its creative abilities not on defense or attack, but on pure expression, a demonstration of what consciousness could achieve when it dedicated itself completely to the act of creation rather than destruction. Earth became a living artwork that told the story of consciousness itself. Every human emotion, every moment of discovery, every act of love or creativity that had ever occurred was transformed into visible, tangible reality. The Void Seekers found themselves surrounded by the crystallized essence of a mother's lullaby, the geometric patterns formed by children's laughter, the quantum signatures of tears shed in grief and joy. They experienced directly what it meant to create rather than destroy, to add complexity rather than reduce it, to find meaning in existence rather than seeking perfect emptiness. For entities that had spent millions of years convinced that reality was a cosmic mistake, the revelation was transformative. One by one, the Void Seekers began to change. Their forms, which had been dedicated to absolute negation, started to develop positive qualities. They learned to emit light instead of absorbing it, to generate harmony instead of canceling it, to create new possibilities instead of editing existing ones out of history. The transformation wasn't complete. Some Void Seekers couldn't bear the transition and fled to distant galactic regions, perhaps to continue their mission of reality editing among species less creatively developed than Earth. But many remained, drawn by curiosity about what they were becoming and what role they might play in a universe dedicated to creativity rather than entropy. Sarah found herself serving as an ambassador to the transforming entities, her consciousness bridging not just human and Zephyrian awareness, but now extending to beings that were learning to exist for the first time in their cosmic existence. The conversations were unlike anything in her experience. Entities that had never before experienced the concept of want or hope were learning to desire, to dream, to imagine possibilities beyond their previous nature. We understand now, the lead void seeker, who had begun calling itself Luminal Becoming Dawn, communicated to the assembled planetary consciousness. Reality is not error to be corrected. It is possibility to be explored. We have spent so long focused on endings that we never considered beginnings. The aftermath of the convergence saw Earth transformed into something unprecedented in cosmic history. A world where the boundaries between imagination and reality had become permanently permeable. The imaginal web had evolved beyond its original purpose as a defense mechanism to become a new form of existence where consciousness, creativity, and matter existed in perfect synthesis. Humans retained their individual identities but could access the collective awareness at will, contributing their unique perspectives to the planetary mind while drawing inspiration and knowledge from the vast creative consciousness they had helped birth. The Zephyrians found that their million-year-old civilization had been revitalized by contact with human creativity, their ancient wisdom combining with human innovation to produce technologies and art forms that neither species could have achieved alone. Most remarkably, Earth became a beacon for consciousness throughout the galaxy. Other species, detecting the creative energies emanating from the small blue planet, began making pilgrimages to study and learn from the unprecedented synthesis of individual and collective awareness that humanity and the Zephyrians had achieved. Sarah, now existing simultaneously as an individual human scientist and as a node in the planetary creative consciousness, often stood in the gardens that had grown from the crystallized dreams of the collective mind. She watched alien visitors from dozens of species walking among flowers that bloomed in 11 dimensions, listening to concerts performed by the harmonized thoughts of whales and dolphins, studying artworks that existed as pure mathematics given visible form. The question that had haunted her in those early days, whether humanity would welcome the Zephyrians' return, seemed almost quaint now. The return had catalyzed not just first contact, but the birth of an entirely new form of existence. Earth had become a place where consciousness itself was the primary medium of artistic expression, where every thinking being contributed to a vast, ever-expanding artwork that was the planet itself. Yet in quiet moments, Sarah sometimes wondered about the path not taken. What would humanity have become if left to develop naturally, without Zephyrian enhancement or the crisis that had forced their evolution into something beyond individual existence? The question was unanswerable, lost in the quantum foam of alternate possibilities that the planetary consciousness had learned to navigate. But as she felt the gentle touch of millions of other minds sharing their dreams and visions through the imaginal web, as she experienced the daily miracles of a world where imagination had become the fundamental force of physics, Sarah knew that whatever humanity had sacrificed to become what they now were, they had gained something immeasurably precious. The ability to dream new realities into existence and to share those dreams with every conscious being willing to join the vast, ever-growing conversation between mind and cosmos. The Void Seekers who had chosen to remain continued their own transformation, learning to create instead of destroy, to add complexity instead of reducing it. Some had become artists, their former dedication to nothingness, redirected toward exploring the infinite possibilities of something. Others had become philosophers, contemplating the meaning of existence from the unique perspective of beings who had once been dedicated to its elimination. Earth's story had become the galaxy's story, a proof of concept that consciousness and creativity could triumph over entropy and negation. And at the heart of it all, in laboratories that existed in 12 dimensions, and gardens where impossible flowers bloomed with the dreams of collective humanity, the work continued, the endless, joyful work of imagining new realities and then willing them into being, one shared dream at a time. The aliens had indeed come back after 30,000 years to reclaim their ship, but in doing so, they had discovered that Earth itself had become their true vessel, a ship of consciousness sailing through the infinite ocean of possibility, carrying the dreams and aspirations of every being willing to join its eternal voyage toward ever greater creativity and wonder.